Hi everyone, this is Ms. Pavo. We're a little bit crunched for time this year, so I've decided to do a historical context for Les Miserables as an audio PowerPoint that you can watch on your own. What I'd like you to do is watch this with my audio recording. I've included the transcripts for this in the description of the video as this is on YouTube. You can also find my speaker notes in the Google Slides version. Make sure you watch this before we come together for class on Monday, because I will expect you to have a handle on this information. It will also provide some helpful background for you as you start the novel. So let's get started. This novel was first published in France and Belgium in 1862, as you can see by the cover page on the right-hand side of the screen. It was written by Victor Hugo, who was a French author. We're going back in time a little bit because we've been hanging around the mid-20th century for the last couple of books. But now we're going back about 100 years to 1862. This is also an important time because we have a lot of tumult in France, which I'll be talking about in just a second. What you should know is that thousands of copies of this book were sold within hours. That is a lot, especially for this time. However, even though the book was wildly popular, there are always critics. These people said that Victor Hugo was dramatizing the misery of the poor. What does that mean? It means that people thought he was making the poor's lives almost like a TV show, dramatizing it and making it seem better than it was. In other words, he was not giving an accurate depiction of the poor's lives. However, even with this criticism, the poor still bought this book in droves and discussed it quite a bit, so it was popular even among them. The setting of this book is between 1815 and 1832. These dates are important because they just happen to match Hugo's youth. In fact, many say that this book is loosely based on the experiences of Victor Hugo as a young man. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a biography or an autobiography. It just means that this book was inspired by what Hugo went through. We'll talk about that a little more in just a second. This book is set in Paris and its outskirts. That means little villages that surrounded Paris at this time. The other thing you need to know is that there was a lot of tension at this time between the rule by royalty and the rule by the people. It's very similar to what was going on in Russia before the revolution. Think about that time. There was Tsar Nicholas, and then the people who wanted to turn against him and create their own government. That's very similar to what's happening in France, which has had a monarchy for hundreds of years at this point. The revolution that happens in the late 18th century in France, which is just before this time, was actually inspired by the American Revolution. So let's talk a little bit about the French Revolution. Here's what was going on at that time. The ruling class lived in wealth, and I mean wealth. They had all of the luxuries that you can imagine. On the other hand, the poor and the bourgeoisie felt mistreated. Remember that the bourgeoisie is the middle class at this time, and they wanted the kinds of wealth that the rich experienced. As a result of these tensions, on July 14, 1789, Parisians, and by this I mean the poor and the bourgeoisie, stormed the Bastille, which was a jail. By doing so, they freed its political prisoners. These were people who spoke out against the monarchy. After this, both royalty and revolutionaries were guillotined. Wondering what guillotine means? The guillotine is a mechanism that cuts off your head with a sharp blade. This is what the French Revolution is often known for. After this happened, the king at the time, King Louis XVI, began a reign of terror. Think of the purge back around this time in the Soviet Union. It was a lot like this. You did not know if you would be able to survive. Then, in 1795, a group of moderates gained power and formed a constitution. Notice the quick changes in power and ruling at this time. This is what France is going to deal with for nearly 50 years. So what happens next? Well, Napoleon takes power. Napoleon I's reign was from 1804 to 1814. That's not a long time. However, he's still a very important figure during this revolution. Napoleon, prior to this, had gained a lot of recognition on the battlefield. After returning from Egypt, he simply declared himself emperor. Wish I could do that. But, like I said, this was short-lived. In 1814, Louis XVIII regains power. Well, just for a year. Then, in 1815, Napoleon returned from where he had been exiled and ruled for 100 days. After this, he was ousted by Louis XVIII again. That's a lot of change in power for people, and you can imagine that this did not go well for the people of France. Notice that 1815 is when this book starts. Then, Louis Philippe gains power. He was from a different ruling house, so this was yet another change in who is ruling France. But he's eventually exiled in 1848. Then, In 1851, Louis Napoleon, who was Napoleon's first nephew, proclaims himself emperor. There is a lot of proclaiming yourself emperor at this time. I don't think that would fly today. Now, the history is a bit more complicated than what I just gave you, but this is really about the story, and so that's where our focus is going to be. So what's the story? It's based on Victor Hugo's perception of the tumult that was going on in France. That means that we are getting what Victor Hugo thinks was happening and how he felt about it. Here's the other thing that you need to know. Hugo thought that the divine didn't come from above, but from the bottom up. That means that we are most likely to find the divine in the poor, those people at the bottom of society. Now, your divine can be whatever it is for you, or if it's nothing, that's fine too. But you should know that Victor Hugo was Christian, believes in Christianity, and thought the divine was God with a capital G. So who was Victor Hugo? His father was a general in one of Napoleon's armies. This means that Hugo's father supported Napoleon and the revolution. His mother, on the other hand, was a royalist. She believes in the monarchy. Victor Hugo was one of three, and when they were young, his mother, whose name was Sophie, abandoned all three of them and went to Paris. After she left, Hugo's father began an affair with a nurse who was actually the one who brought the boys up. But Sophie eventually sends for the boys. They didn't get a lot of attention or a great upbringing there. Sophie was not that interested in them. However, she was a mistress of General Lahorie, who was an important figure of the time. This meant that Hugo and his brothers met quite a few important and influential people in France at that time. At first, Hugo supported Louis Napoleon, but he eventually abandoned this regime in 1849. He saw increasing authoritarianism, which is what ends up happening to a much greater effect in the Soviet Union, which we learned about earlier this year. This didn't work out very well for Hugo, though, because when Louis Napoleon is confirmed leader of the Republic in 1852, Hugo is exiled. 19 years is a long time. Keep this number in mind, though, as it's going to be important for when we start reading the book. Even in exile, Hugo continued to send out his work from Belgium. He writes a lot of political satire, which makes fun of the current regime in power. He had started working on Les Miserables back in 1845, but wrote much of it while in exile. Quick note, Les Miserables is not a political satire. Hugo doesn't even finish it until 1861. Makes sense for a 650-page book. Don't worry, we're reading the abridged version, which is under 400 pages. It's good, I promise. Anyways, Victor Hugo is eventually able to return to France in 1871, and he died in 1885. So what's the genre of this book? We call this historical fiction. Historical fiction intertwines fact and fiction and tries to explain what's going on in history at that time. For Les Miserables, this means that Hugo is trying to explain the turbulence of France during this time of power struggles. The main character, Jean Valjean, is going to provide an anti-political viewpoint, while Marius, another main character, is informed by politics. Remember that Hugo disapproves of Napoleon and is going to be very critical about him. Lastly, I want you to be on the lookout for a few things. First, the most important, is the chain of beneficence. The roots bene mean good, and the root sic means to do or to make. The root ens means of. So beneficence means of doing good. These good actions are both intentional and unintentional, as you will see as you read. The chain also builds as the characters continue to help one another. This chain is connected to the overall good with a capital G. You might see this as part of religion, but I like to see this more of just goodness. Every time I read this book, it inspires me to do good, and I hope it inspires you to do this too. A side note, Hugo sees religion as part of this chain. However, the law is not part of this chain. You will see that Javert is part of the law, while Jean Valjean is part of religion. Another thing that you will see is justice. Hugo believed that laws should be just, not punitive for no reason. Finally, think about this. Hugo thought that you had to descend to ascend. That means being humble, not bragging, and doing good for those beneath you. Let's see how well this holds up in the actual novel. And that's it. Enjoy reading. I look forward to discussing my favorite book with you on Monday.